If you run into me in the Glairmont metro and you're armed, shoot me straight in the head. Shoot at my temple with the barrel slightly tilted downward. I need the bullet to travel the minimum distance inside my brain before reaching my hippocampus. If I'm lucky, the sensation of the bullet passing through my head will only last a few decades. As horrible as it may sound, you would be doing me a huge favor. Losing my life like that as quickly as possible is a much better solution than the alternative that's facing me. My problem started more than 10,000 years ago. At 10:15 this morning, I make money by participating in clinical trials. I'm what they call a healthy subject who takes experimental drugs to find out their side effects. Once I took a drug for the kidneys, and I've also tested blood pressure or cholesterol medication several times. This morning they told me that the drug I had taken was a psychoactive substance meant to speed up brain functions. None of the medications I had tried up to that point had done anything to me in a recreational sense, I mean. In other words, none of the medications I had been given had any psychoactive effect on me. Maybe I had always been given placebos without knowing it, but that was clearly not the case with this one. Today's medication was different. It worked. He gave me a pill at 10:15 and told me to wait in the waiting room until he called me in for some tests. The research assistant told me I wouldn't have to wait more than 30 minutes. So I sprawled out on the couch in the waiting room and read a few articles from a psychology magazine that was lying on the little coffee table. I finished reading it, but he still hadn't called. So I started reading this morning's newspaper, and once I finished, I read another magazine. I was wondering what was taking them so long. I slowly turned my head to glance at the clock, and it was only 10:23. So I had read 3 different things in just 8 minutes. I remember thinking that it was going to be a very long day, and I was more than right. In the waiting room there was a small bookshelf with some books on it. When I got up to walk over to her, I felt like my legs were barely working. It wasn't like they were weak, they were just slow. It took me a whole minute to get up from the couch, and another minute just to take 2 steps to the bookshelf. I looked at the different books, and I chose a copy of Moby Dick. My arms obviously had the same problem as my legs. Just reaching out my arm to grab the book took me an incalculable amount of time. I even got bored waiting for my hand to reach the groove of the book. I turned back toward the couch and collapsed onto it in such a slow fall. It reminded me of the astronaut's jumps on the moon due to gravity. I slowly opened Moby Dick and I started to read. I started with "Call me, Ishmael," and I read up to the part where Ahab throws the pipe into the sea. And if you've never read Moby Dick, that happens in chapter 30. And that's when they finally called me.
So, how do you feel?
The research assistant asked me. I feel slow, I replied.
Actually, it's the opposite. Everything seems slow to you because you're too fast.
But my legs, my arms, they're moving in slow motion.
Your body feels like it's moving slowly because your brain is going too fast. It's working 10 to 20 times faster than average. You think and perceive reality at an accelerated pace, but your body is still limited by the laws of biomechanics. Honestly, you move faster than a normal person.
She said, mimicking someone running.
But your brain moves so fast that even the fastest speed at which you walk feels slow to you.
I thought back to my slow motion fall onto the couch in the waiting room. Even if my muscles were slowed down, my body still should have reacted to gravity in the same way. In other words, why? Even gravity seemed to be just as slowed down as my muscles were. The slowing down of my muscles couldn't explain why gravity seemed so slow to me. My brain must have been going at a more than spectacular speed, and that was probably how it was. That I had managed to read 2 magazines, a newspaper, and the first 30 chapters of Moby Dick in 15 minutes. They had me take a series of tests afterwards. They were actually quite fun, by the way. They had me juggle with 3 balls, then 4, then 6. I had no problem, even with the 6 balls, because they seemed to move at an astonishingly slow speed. I just had to wait for each ball to make a knock before slowly falling back into my hand. Then they tossed Cheerios into the air and I managed to catch them all with chopsticks. After that, they did the same thing with a handful of coins and I was able to count the total amount before it hit the ground. The cognitive tests, on the other hand, were much less fun, but very revealing. Finishing a crossword puzzle, 3 seconds, finding the way out of a maze drawn on a sticky note, viewing slideshows at 10 images per second for 2 seconds and answering detailed questions about them. About what I had seen, 95% correct. They also told me that I scored 250 on the Kopf scale. Apparently, that corresponded to the supernatural range on the quick thinking scale. Then, they sent me back home.
The effects will wear off in a few hours.
The assistant told me.
Of course, it will seem to last 10 days for you. Try to use these effects to your advantage by getting ahead on your work, for example, or other things you want to do.
The trip to my place was horrible. I was only 3 subway stations away, and normally it would have only taken 35 minutes. But in my perception of the sped up world, it felt like it lasted for days. Horribly long days. Just walking from the assistant's desk to the elevator felt like it took me an hour. I had run out of the office, trying to persuade my legs to go faster, but without success. No matter how much my brain wanted the rest of my body to follow, I was still a prisoner of the laws of biomechanics. The great disconnect between my body and my mind made it extremely difficult to know when to slow down or simply turn my body. It was as if I had turned into some kind of huge human rag, unable to move the way I was supposed to. At one point I misjudged my speed and smashed my finger against the wall, right next to the elevator button. Even though I saw the wall with the button getting closer to my finger, I couldn't move it fast enough to keep it from getting smashed against it. It was violent, and the pain was really intense. If my brain had been working at normal speed, it probably would have hurt for about 30 seconds. But in my current state, the pain seemed to last for well over half an hour. Around 45 minutes. The elevator ride down had been exhausting. It felt like it took me 4 or 5 hours to go down the 7 floors with nothing to distract me except the walls of the elevator. Afterwards, I also wanted to run to get to the subway. And I have to admit that this part was almost fun compared to everything else. Even though my body was moving, in my opinion, very quickly, I could still move carefully and decide where and how I was going to place my feet, move my arms, and turn my torso. In just 2 steps and 1 house, I adjusted to this brain operating 24 times faster than my body. I kept going like that the rest of the way, twisting and brushing past people on the sidewalks and cars on the road by just a few centimeters. I spent an hour, according to my timeline, going down into the subway and running to the platform. It was endless boredom having to wait the 6 minutes before the subway arrived. Even though there was more to see on the platform than inside the elevator, it was still intensely boring. I should have stolen the copy of Moby Dick. The subway arrived roaring into the station very slowly. The brake's high-pitched sound had become a deep, monotonous noise because of my situation. It wasn't just the sound of the subway that was 3 octaves lower than usual. The sounds were slowed down to the point of near inaudibility. Voices had disappeared, far too slow to reach the frequency I was able to hear. I still managed to hear a baby's cries in my train car, but it sounded more like a whale song. The sounds, sudden and sharp, like car horns and trucks bouncing over potholes, were far too low, and they sounded more like thunder rumbling miles away. When I was at the research company, I could always hear and communicate with the research team, but now any verbal communication was impossible for me. The effects of the drug were intensifying. I spent what felt like days in that damn subway. Days! Listening to the whale-like cries coming from the baby and the brakes that sounded like a tuba solo. Although the sounds were completely different to me, the smells were not. I couldn't get used to the stench of the subway. The mix of bodily fluids and urine that spread throughout the train car. After what seemed like forever, I finally made it back to my apartment. Rushing inside at full speed, it felt like a peaceful drift down a river's current. I was relieved to be home, at least I knew what I could do there. So I picked up a book I had been reading a few days earlier, 100 Years of Solitude, and I finished it. I turned the pages so quickly that I tore a few of them. I felt like most of my time had been spent turning the pages, not actually reading them. It had only been 3 minutes since I got home. I tried to go online after taking forever to turn on that damn computer, but it was so slow that I just got way too frustrated. It took hours just to load a single page, and only a split second to read it completely. More than 100 articles later, and again, barely 3 minutes had passed, I went through my list of books I wanted to read and finished 2 more. All of that in 4 minutes. So I decided to try to sleep so the effects would wear off faster. Unfortunately, the part of my brain responsible for perceiving time, the one that had been sped up by the medication, wasn't the same as the part that controlled sleep. Although it felt like I'd been awake for days. My body, on the other hand, knew it was only 1:25 post-meridium and it wasn't ready to fall asleep. I headed to my room, wanting to try anyway. I let myself fall onto my mattress like a feather. I closed my eyes and I stayed lying there for hours and hours. Which was actually only 10 minutes in reality. Then I gave up, I couldn't do it. Being trapped in that mental prison was hellish, so I took a sleeping pill. The feeling of the pill and the water I took to swallow it was horribly unpleasant. In my throat, I felt like there was a lump blocking my breathing and taking its sweet time to go down my esophagus. After that horrible moment, I read a book for 10 minutes, then I read another one. It had been 18 minutes since I took the sleeping pill. I threw the book in my hands away in disgust. At the other end of the room, he did a grotesque pirouette, like a leaf blown by the wind, then hit the wall with a soft rumble. That was actually the only sound I had heard for what felt like hours. Then the book fell to the floor, taking its time, like a flip-flop sinking into a pool. The gravity force remained constant since taking the pill. The laws of physics were the same. My perception of time was completely skewed. That meant I could use the speed at which things fell as a way to judge the effects of what I had taken. Based on how long it took the book to fall to the ground, I estimated that the effects of the medication were still intensifying. I then read a magazine, and then I turned on the television. I realized I was perceiving the video sequences like a PowerPoint presentation. Frustrated, I turned it off. So I read a bit more. This time, it was the first 2 volumes of Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples. And honestly, I hated it. But considering how many hours of boredom it would have taken me to go get another book from the shelf, I preferred to stick with these books. It was much better that way. 35 minutes had passed since taking the sleeping pill. So I laid down on the couch, then I closed my eyes. Time passed, I inhaled, which took me an hour. More time passed, I exhaled for several hours. And despite that, I still couldn't fall asleep. I needed another plan of action. So I went back to the company that gave me that medication. I figured maybe they had something to counter the effects, or at least knock me out until it wore off. So I left my apartment as quickly as possible, even though for me, it felt like it took forever. I didn't even take the time to lock my door. That would have taken too long. I ran down the stairs. It was faster than taking the elevator. I crossed the lobby and went out into the street. For me, a whole day had passed with the dexterity of a human endowed with supernatural powers. I ran along the sidewalks. I flew over the first set of stairs leading to the subway, and that's when the sleeping pill started to take effect. Only I wasn't tired, not at all. Instead of that, it was as if there was a severe interaction with the pill I had taken that morning. As I was going down the second set of stairs in slow motion, moving really slowly, everything stopped. The monotonous roar of the streets and the noise of the subway had completely stopped, replaced by the most perfect silence I had ever experienced. My descent seemed to have halted completely. Before taking the sleeping pill, my perception of time was maybe 100 times slower than reality, but at that moment it seemed to be thousands of times slower. Each second now felt like it lasted for entire days. Just the simple act of moving my eyes to try to look at something felt like my eyes were traveling miles across my field of vision. I had gotten used to it and above all had learned how to run, walk and jump in a very short time. The medication had left me totally destabilized. The effects of the two medications combined now made it impossible for me to move my body. And even though I was like frozen in the act of walking, I was unable to properly control my muscles. I ordered my foot to move forward for hours, then to move backward for hours more. I felt I would miss the next step. Long hours spent trying to adjust the angle of my ankle, then readjusting it again when I thought I wasn't going to make it. And despite all that effort, I still managed to twist my ankle on the next step. The pain wasn't eased by time at all. Hours of suffering and weight on my twisted ankle. The nerve signal that sent the sensation of pain to my brain seemed to work differently from the nerves in my ears. The pain flooded my brain, unchanged by my new perception of time. Hours and hours of gradual weight on my twisted ankle turned into hours of evolving pain. I went ahead, my brain too fast, completely unable to control, my body too slow. I fell for what felt like days, and I managed to turn my torso just enough, so that my head wouldn't hit the ground hard. I finally landed on my right shoulder. At first, the impact was barely noticeable, and then I felt a slight pressure in my shoulder. As it hit the ground, the pressure increased, plunging me into unbearable pain for hours. My shoulder eventually gave out, by completely dislocating, with a tear that made me nauseous. I finished falling days later, and I lay on the floor staring at the ceiling. The pain in my shoulder kept tormenting me like a fresh and violent wound. I had ample time to think as I fell. If every second felt like days to me, then every real minute should last for years. Even if the drug left my system in the next 2 or 3 hours, this nightmare would last for me hundreds of years. I then made a decision. I had a plan. I had to make it to the platform and throw myself in front of the first train. So I turned around to get on my hands and knees, my shoulder begging me for a break. But I miscalculated my turn and fell back onto my back. So I tried again, and this time I landed on my face. I was really trying by all means to figure out how to control this body that moved more slowly than grass growing. My weeks of effort were finally rewarded when I finally managed to steady myself on my knees and hands. If getting on all fours was already so difficult, then walking or running was out of the question. So I crawled through the subway tunnels, then under the turnstile, in front of the dumbfounded looks of the many people all around me. For weeks, until I finally managed to reach the escalator. It was carrying people down at the same speed as a glacier collapsing into the ocean. As I fell endlessly, I examined the bonder platform. The display board indicated the next subway would arrive in 20 minutes. For me, 20 minutes had now become like a year. I was going to have to wait a year on the subway platform before I could finally put an end to this horror. I got off the escalator, trying to avoid people's eyes. I kept crawling to a bench and curled up next to it, trying to find a less painful position for my shoulder. And that's when my problem got even worse. Much worse. The slowing down of time that I had just experienced on the stairs was only the beginning of the interaction between the sleeping pill and the experimental drug. The effects reached their peak. As I was curled up near the bench, I blinked and hours of darkness followed. The sounds had already disappeared, and now it was my sight's turn. All that was left was the pain from my fall. My ultra-fast brain wasted no time compensating for the lack of sensory information. So I started hearing voices. They sang to me in a language that had never existed. Patterns and faces, but also colors, came and went in my mind. I remembered my life and imagined myself living another one. I had even forgotten French. I sank into an almost total despair. I spoke to God. I even became God. I imagined a universe and brought it to life through thought. Then I did it again. And again. My eyes reopened with a disconcerting slowness, a slight brightness. Weeks, A ray of light weaks a narrowed view of the platform, the ankles of passengers next to me, and an advertisement on the opposite wall. Morning wakes again. I then took my phone out of my pocket, which took me decades. I don't know how I could explain this boredom I felt, but the pain in my shoulder was nothing compared to that. All the thoughts I had already had them 100 times before. The state of ankles in advertisements never changes. Never. My despair was intense and tangible, like a particularly solid metal object piercing through my skull. It was inevitable. So what are my options? If I crawl and end up on the tracks without the subway hitting me, I won't die. I'll probably feel more pain than with my shoulder, and I'll definitely be rescued by a kind soul from the platform. And then I'll be unable to act when the subway finally arrives. In this scenario, the pain would be endless, infinite. So I waited for the subway so I could throw myself under it, and then it finally hit me. The fact that I was going to experience pain, to be torn into pieces. For dozens of years, I lived hundreds of lives at the foot of that bench. Spiritually, I am much older than any human being who has ever walked the surface of this planet. Most of my life, I seem to have spent curled up on the platform with an unchanging view of ankles and advertisements. So this audio is my plan B, my very last chance. I don't know how many times it will need to be slowed down to be barely understandable, but I pray that it's possible. I've spent several lifetimes recording and posting it, hoping that someone would hear it. And I really hope that this person will be kind enough to decide that it's time to put an end to my suffering. And that if he finds a man curled up under a bench, the same man who crawled along the escalator, he will finally put an end to his ordeal. So, if you are that person and you really are on that subway platform, please stop this nightmare.